Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Shane Pill and Dr. Brendan SueSee. Gents, welcome.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
Nice to be with you this evening.
Well, it's great to have you both on. Shane, you're a returning guest. Brendan, this is your first time on the Sports Psych Show. Let's start where we always start, with some introductions. Dr. Brendan SueSee, it'd be great to learn a little bit about you and your work.
Thanks, Dan, for having us on the show, obviously. I was a high school phys ed teacher for 20 years before I came to the dark side, known as university. And I've worked with Shane, even though we're not at the same university, on most of the research and publications we've done, as we have a real passion for pedagogy and coaching. And obviously, there's a fair bit of overlap between phys ed teaching. Perhaps I shouldn't say obviously, because we have experience questioning at times when we say obviously, but a bit of an overlap between phys ed teaching and sports coaching. And so we continue to do things in terms of pedagogy, sports coaching, and probably where we've done a fair bit of work lately is with something called the spectrum of teaching styles. And we've taken it over to sports coaching. And now I've been at university for 7 years, I think, and miss probably teaching high school kids. I know some people might say that I might need to see someone about that, but I probably have supplemented that passion with a bit more sports coaching now, I guess. So that's probably the 2-second version of me.
And the spectrum of teaching styles is something that we're going to focus on today. Brendan, just a quick question back at you. What sport or sports do you coach?
At the moment, I coach netball and cricket predominantly. I have 2 girls, and this might make me sound like Dodgy Dad of the Year award winner, but after I coached one of them for 3 years, of course, there was no way that I would be able to escape coaching the other one for 3 years. Or I could have tried that, but I'm sure my bed perhaps would have ended up outside. Yeah, coaching cricket and netball.
And do you have a sporting background yourself?
Yeah, probably like most phys ed teachers, played baseball, actually, which is probably a bit unusual for an Australian, but played that for quite a long period of time. Field hockey, which I gave up probably when I was about 15 because I got probably a little bit better at baseball. And did a lot of athletics and cross country and running, triathlons as well. I'm definitely going to sound like I've got a problem here. They were more like hobbies that I enjoyed doing. But just, I don't know, probably like a lot of phys ed teachers, Dan, or a lot of people in general enjoy being physically active.
You were a generalist and not a specialist.
Yeah, roughly, I guess. Played baseball for quite a while, until I was about 35. Went to national titles here as a junior and stuff like that, and played A grade in the city that I live in. But no superstar.
Well, it's great to have you on, and really excited to unpack spectrum of teaching styles with you, because I know you're a global leader in this area. And coming over to yourself, Dr. Shane Pill, it's great to have you back on. I know so many people listening in know about you, your work. I know so many people listened into our last podcast episode together. But remind us, tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us about your work.
Naimani, which in Ghana language is hope you are good. I'm speaking from Ghana Miana Yerda, which is Ghana people land, commonly referred to as the Adelaide Plains. Born and raised on the Adelaide Plains, son of Glenn and Mayu, brother to Michelle and Cherie, father to Del, Nathan and James, married to Kate for 35 years, been coaching since 1988 when I coached, I think it was a year 8 boys football team at the school that I was there. And then following year, I changed schools and I was thrust into coaching the first 18 football team, even though I was only a couple of years older than the lads. You know, when the deputy principal of the new school you're at comes up to you and says, you're it, you don't really have much choice. So I've been coaching for as long as I've been teaching. I came from a sporty family. Dad was a well-credentialed SANFL footballer back in the days before the AFL, and the SANFL was the state league competition, competing with the other state league competitions. and he's a Hall of Famer at the club that he played for. Mum was very sporty, netball, squash. Dad played squash post-retirement. So I grew up in a sporty family, grew up around football clubs, squash courts, tennis clubs, midweek ladies tennis competitions. So while I am perhaps not the greatest sports person myself, I was brought into a very sporty environment and had sport as a major part of my life from a very young age.
When you were last on, Shane, the plan had been to spend a good hour, hour and a quarter talking about Mostyn's spectrum of teaching styles and its application in a sporting environment. But so engrossed was I in talking all things coaching outside of that spectrum with yourself, and so average was my hosting, that we actually never got on to really speaking that much. I think we spent the last 10-15 minutes rushing through the teaching style. So we pledged to get you back on fairly quickly. But as you quite rightly pointed out, that as much as you are indeed an expert, Shane, in this area, and you've done a lot of research in this area, you've written a book in this area, you insisted that Dr. Brendan SueSee, who is somebody I've always wanted to get onto the show, but you insisted that Brendan come on, explaining to me that Brendan is the leading authority on this area. Can you kind of introduce Brendan to us a bit, Shane, here in terms of his authority in this area and your relationship and sort of working partnership with him? Just to embarrass you, Brendan, as you sit there.
Yeah, I first met Brendan in 2009 at a conference. He was a teacher. I'd not long been in university and admired his capacity for wit as well as his capacity to get to the heart of a conversation and have well-reasoned debates of ideas and be able to hold those debate of ideas in a way that everybody walked away really friendly at the end of it, which is a unique skill set to be able to have when you're debating ideas. He likes coffee, which is always a bonus. So Brandon and I probably rekindled contact when Brendan's PhD supervisor suggested he contact me to help with some work. Now, sitting behind that was Brendan did his PhD using the spectrum of teaching styles to analyse Queensland senior teachers' adherence to the key verbs of cognitive behaviour in the syllabus document to see whether there was alignment between the enacted practice and the expected practice being that described in the syllabus document. And Brendan contacted me and said, I've been looking at this game sense approach and game-based teaching ideas, and it's described everywhere as discovery, and in particular, often as guided discovery. I don't reckon it is. I reckon it's often command and practice. And I thought, that's interesting. Let's have a conversation about this. And a debate of ideas emerged. And from that debate of ideas, Brendan convinced me that often the descriptions of game-based approaches, and in particular those that come from a teaching for understanding lineage, often are in the literature as examples of recall with the questioning episodes, not necessarily discovery, particularly because there's no sense of making players' existing knowledge, skills, and understanding visible in order to go where they are not in the discovery episode. And that was a terrific moment of understanding for me and clarity in some of the work that I was doing to be able to describe a game-based approach with greater emphasis on when it is discovery and when it doesn't need to be discovery, because that's not the purpose of the inquiry episode that you're doing with the players. And since then, we've been able to collaborate on a number of projects that bring to light many of the ideas that we've discussed. So that's Brendan, leading authority in the spectrum of teaching styles.
If this wasn't a podcast, you'd see me blushing.
I can see it now. Well, as a leading authority on the spectrum of teaching styles, I'd love to unpack with you, Brendan, the spectrum of teaching styles. Let's begin at the beginning, and just to say, and I say this, Brendan, on all episodes of the Sports Psych show when I feel that I'm not necessarily speaking about, or we're not necessarily speaking about, a subject that lies at the heart of sports psychology, or what might be considered at the heart of sports psychology: mental skills, well-being, mental health, healthy and safe practice environments, etc., etc. But I'm a sports psychologist, Brendan, who takes a broad definition of sports psychology. I think as a sports psychologist, it's so imperative for me to be the best that I can be, and for us as a profession to be the best that we can be, that we need to know this stuff. We need to know about teaching and coaching, coaching science, skill acquisition, and so on and so forth, to be the best that we can be. And obviously learning a psychological construct lies at the heart of all of this, right? So I think it's very relevant for the Sports Psych Show to explore these areas. So as that as a bit of a forerunner here, Brendan, introduce us to the spectrum of teaching styles. Go back as far as you'd like. Start wherever you want to.
Alrighty, just make sure you tell me to be quiet, Dan, if I don't shut up, because probably like most academics, that's normally the problem. We talk too much. I guess from I came across it as an undergrad, really briefly at university, and I was probably intrigued by this concept. And probably the one that got me most of all was when I learned about Mostyn, as they say, discovering the spectrum. And he kind of says discovering in the same way that like Newton discovered gravity. Gravity always existed. People were always falling over or out of things, but he kind of worked out or said, hey, this is what I think's going on. And Mostyn, when he defined teaching as a deliberate chain of decision making, and looked at who was making the decisions, when they were being made, and what they were about. He then found these 11 teaching styles. Now, when he started off, he didn't find, if you want to say, 11 teaching styles, but that has developed over time. And the thing that really resonated, I think, to start off with, was him sort of like saying, no one really has a style. We choose styles. And this is where he started to speak about this idiosyncratic approach that teachers have, confusion with language. So I might say to Pilly, I'm doing inquiry, and he goes, so am I. And then we start talking about it. And then I realize he's doing something a little bit different to me. And so there's not a common language for it. And then it's also for it to sound very, I don't know, mystical as well. It's also a bit of a philosophy. So another part I really enjoy about it is they speak about having a non-versus approach. So Mostyn and Ashworth don't actually say one style is better than another. In one way, that would be like arguing that the screwdriver is the best tool ever. Someone would go, not for chopping wood, you'll be there for a while. So you pick the style for its utility or for what it can achieve. And in one way, there is no point in having a discussion or an argument about what's the best style unless you actually know what are you trying to achieve. So in the same way, if you said, oh, look, I'm looking to chop wood, then there is a best tool for chopping wood, but that doesn't mean the saw is the best. And in the same way as a teaching style, if you want to achieve synchronicity and movement on cue, then you'd pick a certain style for that. If you wanted the learner to discover multiple answers, you would pick a style for that as well. And the other part, besides the non-versus approach, which I like, is that they also, and this guy Mostyn in 1966 was coming up with these ideas, recognized that humans had, in his model of the world, 5 developmental channels: the social channel, the physical, the ethical, the emotional, and the cognitive. And it's probably, again, one of these classics where I didn't realize it at the time. And it's probably, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Pilly, maybe only in the last 15, 20 odd years we're in Australia that we've kind of actually even started to address in phys ed more than just the cognitive and the physical, where we've actually started to look at other things, and then to sit there and go, wow. So Mostyn was talking about this over 50 years ago, these channels. Was just, obviously ahead of his time, I think, in those ideas.
I love that notion of coaching being a deliberate chain of decision making. Coaches are decision makers. They're deciding how to approach their coaching depending on the context they find themselves. Is kind of what's floating around my mind right now. And I also love, and Shane, will come to you here, picking up on what you said at the end there, Brendan, with these channels. Decision making working in servitude to a social channel, a physical channel, an ethical channel, a cognitive channel, an emotional channel. It's a wonderful introduction to spectrum of teaching styles coming to you, Shane, here as Brendan was speaking. What did that make you reflect on?
Mostyn was writing in the 1960s in a period coming out of a modern approach to physical education. And that modern approach to physical education was directed at physical education in its broadest sense. It wasn't physical education, the subject. It was anybody that was involved in the education through the physical to develop the human potential of that individual. So physical education in lowercase was an outcome. Physically educated lowercase is an outcome. Physical education is a process. Physical education capitalised is a subject that occurs in schools. But as Siedentop, for example, said in the early 1970s, there are many instances where you are more physically educated in a sports setting than what you are in a school physical education class. And that's because of the pedagogical decision-making of the teacher and the pedagogical decision-making of the coach. And part of that pedagogical decision-making is what aspects of learning and development are you focused on? Are you focused only on the physical, or are you developing the holistic person? And out of this period of the 1960s comes Mostyn Spectrum's teaching styles. We see Hellison developing humanistic physical education. We see Siedentop on the path towards the sport education model. These models for sport coming from physical educators trained to be teachers, looking at developing the whole person using movement as the stimulus, movement as the unique experience. And probably a little bit different from Brendan, I was familiar with the different developmental channels as objectives of physical education. So the idea of cognitive, social, emotional, physical development, I was already familiar with that as the objectives of holistic physical education. But the spectrum of teaching styles I didn't encounter in my teacher education. I didn't encounter in my first 15 to 18 years of teaching. It wasn't until I came to Flinders University and Russell Brown was basing the foundations of our physical education program in the spectrum of teaching styles as the pedagogical platform for our students to understand their work as creating learning environments, that I was introduced to the spectrum of teaching styles. And then that was 2006, and a couple of years later met Brendan, and as the universe tends to do, it gives us a direction, and Brendan was very much focused on the spectrum of teaching styles. I had some familiarity with it here at Flinders University, and it provided a really strong sense of direction to there's an opportunity here to provide clarity, whether it's in models-based practice, whether it's in understanding theoretical perspectives that lead to particular ways of teaching about thinking and learning, to provide both a common language but also a clarity between what the style is able to achieve with the learner, and then by default what that style is not able to achieve with the learner, so that the educator, and the educator in the broader sense, whether being a coach or a teacher, is able to be very intentional in making sure that there is alignment between the need of the learner or the outcome anticipated for the learner, that connection to task, which is experienced through a pedagogical encounter, which is a teaching style choice.
I want to again share what's going on in my mind as you're speaking there. Two words that really hit home for me here and that excite me greatly are intentional and framework. Let me just unpack framework, and Brendan will come to you here for some further thoughts. But listening to what you said there, Shane, the teaching styles, the spectrum of teaching styles can offer clarity, direction, a common language. And as a psychologist, I'm passionate about helping players, people, have frameworks to their mental world, mental models, if you like, for themselves in order to perform, to thrive, in order to learn. I'm a big believer in frameworks to organize one's mental world and physical world. So I think the teaching styles offer a framework, and especially if you think of coaching, where potentially coaching, especially for the beginner coach, can feel like a mishmash of lots of different things. It can feel quite unstructured, and you borrow from here and you borrow from there, and you jump on YouTube and you read a book, and it's wow, hang on, there's these 11 teaching styles and these channels, for example, that can fuse together to create a framework that feels like you can organize yourself a bit better. And just finally, Brendan, coming to you here, that word intentional that Shane has used, I know from your book, which we're going to unpack a bit more in a second, that teaching styles is deliberate teaching. Is that, or deliberate coaching even?
Yeah.
That's that word, intentional, deliberate, on purpose. I think that's so important. A few thoughts for you there, Brendan.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. I guess it's this concept of the deliberate teaching, and that the 11 styles that emerge when we look at who's making the decision and when it's being made, and the intention. And the whole time, I guess, as we move along the spectrum from A to K, we're trying to get the learner or the participant or the player, whatever term we want to use here, to move to more independence of learning and thinking. You could nearly say that that is what is the ultimate aim eventually for any learner. And Shane and I are both quite happy, even though I said we've had some pushback at times or question on this when we say coach and teacher and saying they're the same. I guess we're roughly wrapping that idea around the idea of saying, if you have a body of knowledge that you wish your participant or learner or whatever you want to say at some point later on to reproduce with efficiency, with accuracy, with speed, then you are essentially, it is an educative purpose, coaching and teaching. It's like the same thing in that way. So that's where we're certainly not worried here if we say student or participant, etc., or coach or teacher. It's the same thing. It's an educative process, because even if you look at the top level of, say, like us perhaps watching the Matildas last night play against Denmark, that you're saying that, in this situation, Tony Gustafsson would have wanted these things roughly to happen, and the players to execute at this appropriate point in time. And that's where we're saying it's like a body of knowledge. So then when you look at who's making the decision, et cetera, these tenets, and you also speak about 3 places in a learning episode is the term we might use, that you say there's this concept of pre-impact, which quite simply is might be saying, okay, well, at this session, this is what I'd like my learners to achieve. The impact set, as they call it, is, if you want to call it the doing, or in the words of Baldrick, unleashing an evil plan, of going, here we go, this is what's going to happen now in this learning episode. And then post-impact is where you provide the feedback to the learner about how well they met that original criteria or whatever you're explaining, which meets the objective. So even though Mostyn and Ashworth kind of draw that as a line, I think Pilley and I have kind of, and this is perhaps another model for us to join Pilley and upset the spectrum purists, is I really like to view it as a circle, that it's just constantly going around itself, that the feedback you give the learner then feeds back on, okay, well, what do I need to change as the coach to get the player to be able to meet the objective that I was trying to do? And then so we start at the beginning of the spectrum with style A, where the teacher or the coach is making maximum amount of decisions and the learner is making the minimum amount. And as you move along to style K through those 11 styles, if you want to say there's a relationship where the teacher or coach's decision-making goes down to minimum and the learner or participant's decision-making goes up to maximum. And I think once you become aware of these things or these concepts, as Mostyn describes them, I think it nearly becomes so, I'm not going to say you'll ever be the perfect teacher. Humans are too complex, all of us. But it becomes so scalpel-like, where you can go, Well, I want my players in this situation to recall movements. So I will therefore choose practice style. If you said I want them to recall movements and cues, like reading perceptual cues, then you would create an environment where they needed to identify those perceptual cues as well at the same time. The opportunity to identify and practice them and recall them.
There's a couple of things there just to elaborate on quickly. So what Brendan's described there is that coaching is a series of episodes. It's not one thing. And those episodes will have a particular combination of teaching styles. So we surf the spectrum from episode to episode, and we cluster the teaching styles for the purposes of that episode. So while the spectrum had historically been presented as like a linear, as a horizon sort of move from A to K, left to right, going back and reading Mostyn's work, he never saw it as a linear progression. He actually saw it as mobility ability. The art of the coach, the art of the teacher, pedagogically, is that mobility ability within the spectrum to align the learning need through the task to achieve the purposeful outcome. So therefore, it's not taking young players to senior players on a journey along the spectrum. It's more non-linear than that. And indeed, we use the example of the Craig Johnston story of a 15-year-old who designs his own practice gym in the car park and self-teaches to become a better player. And then when he's suddenly called on to be an emergency, comes off the bench, kicks a couple of goals, and people go, who's been training this kid for the last 12 months? He's been training himself, self-coaching. So that production style towards the right-hand side of the spectrum, he was doing as a 15, 16-year-old. And we go back and we read the autobiography of players, and we see from a young age that young players often use a self-teaching style. Now, there's the stories of Steve Waugh getting in the shed with the ball in a stocking to practice a particular way of hitting the ball. He's self-teaching. So it's a really important point to note that they're not layered in the sense of one, then the other, that it's mobility ability within the spectrum that I guess shows the pedagogical maturity or the pedagogical craft of the coach as an educator.
Putting together what you've both been speaking to there, it makes me think of a body of literature that we've spoken about on the Sports Psych Show a few times, and that's professional judgment and decision making. And I know this isn't the same, but there feels like some correlation here that actually utilizing the spectrum styles for professional judgment and decision making. We spoke to Dr. Andrew Abraham about it, Dr. Mike Ashford, Dr. Lowell Collins about professional judgment and decision making. That coaching is this constant process of decision making. It also makes me think about the conversations we've had on the show around building in psychosocial elements into your coaching. And really, I suppose I'm referring to the channels here, that coaching isn't just about, teaching the sport. It's also incorporating social and ethical and emotional factors and practices into this as well. And then the final thing it's making me think of, returning to something you were saying there, Brendan, I was thinking of that classic plan, do, review, that the channels, the styles, which we will come on and unpack in a minute, are wrapping around those is essentially plan, do, review. I'm going to plan what style I want to use based on the context and the challenges I'm confronting. I go and do it, and then I review it. I can review it on my own. I can review it with players. So no question, guys, but just I love the neatness and tidiness and thoroughness of this in what is quite a complex professional hobby, if you like.
Yeah, it is definitely. I think at times I often joke with Pilly that I sometimes feel in a room, if I talk about the spectrum, I say there's 11 styles, I nearly feel like I can hear people tapping out already. Like, oh, come on, give me a break. I can barely do three. But again, like you're saying, once you learn it, I think it is quite simple. I know perhaps a lot of people out there in podcast land would say, of course, you two would say it's simple since we've spent a bit of time on it. But when you start to experiment with it and play with it and see what you're doing, and like you said, this idea of plan, do, review, the three places where the decisions are made. And if you have someone to help you walk through it, I think you will see many overlaps. And that's the other one, I think, with the spectrum. I've, in chats with Pilly, have once said before, it's like a bit of a taxonomy, like I can't remember the Swedish guy's name, Carl von Linné, the guy who made the taxonomy system for animals. These animals existed before he made the system. It's not like he made the system and then the platypus rolled up. No, the platypus was always there swimming around what it was doing. Same as all these styles were there. It's just he kind of speaks about them. Oh, well, if you're making these decisions, this is where it is. So even at times, if people say, "Oh, I don't use that style," or "I don't do this style," you think, well, you mightn't use all of them, but you are using a teaching style because you are asking your learner to make decisions, and you are making decisions at times as well. So,
and for me, the essential advantage of something like teaching styles is that, as you're saying, coaches are doing lots of these. They might not be coaching from styles A to K, but they're doing this anyway. What the teaching styles does is it wraps things neatly in a framework, and we need, as human beings, we need greater certainty in an uncertain world. Especially coaching is a very uncertain world. Having a framework that allows for individual differences and allows for the complexity of the environment that we're coaching in. Having a framework helps us organize our world, which I think is imperative.
Not only does it help organise our world, but if we take this to an analogy, you recently had a podcast with Doug Lemov.
Yep.
And he talked about the comparison between learning to read a book and what the science tells us about learning to read and reading a game,
Yep.
and the important role that language plays in providing the mental representations. And if we're not using a common language, we may not be having the same mental representations. Or we don't know if we're having the same mental representations because we're giving it different language. So therefore, we don't have a way of talking to each other that confirms that we're actually understanding each other. In fact, we probably walk away confused. And Mostyn recognised this back in 1966, saying that there is a need for a common language to provide the mental representations to get everybody aligned to have the productive conversations. And we saw this with one of our colleagues doing his PhD work. The spectrum of coaching styles not only provides an audit for coaches to understand the intentionality of what they're doing, it provides coach developers with a auditing tool to find out whether the coach's philosophy is actually aligned with their pedagogical expression. And what our colleague Mitch Hewitt found, who used the spectrum of teaching styles to audit tennis coaches, there was a misalignment between the type of coaches they thought they were and their players' experience of their coaching, because the teaching styles that the coaches were choosing did not align with what they said was their philosophy of coaching. And so not only, therefore, can we see the spectrum of teaching styles having great utility for the individual coach or group of coaches to have common language and understanding the intentionality of the plan, do, review, or the pre-impact, impact, and post-impact, it provides an opportunity for coach developers to bring clarity to the coaches that they are actually aligning what they think they are doing with what they are actually doing.
I think some of the really classic examples from Mitch's PhD, which he spoke about, Dan, was that quite often coaches thought they were doing like teaching games for understanding or a game-like situation, etc. But because they didn't have that common language, they would say things like, "Oh, well, I ask open-ended questions. I must be doing discovery learning," or they're playing a game, so it is solving a problem. Whereas the spectrum is very specific, saying, well, if you're asking someone an open-ended question, that on its own doesn't make a discovery, especially if you're asking them to recall things which they know the answer to. And of course, the spectrum also argues, perhaps controversially, saying, well, it's not solving a problem if you actually know the answer to it. That's still called recall, which doesn't mean it's wrong. There are times you want to practice recall so that someone will perform a skill on cue and very well. But that's completely different to saying, I want you to discover something which perhaps will look inefficient, full of errors, perhaps a little ugly, but then a big sense of joy at the end when you do solve it.
I love this, and I think to complete this conversation here as an overview of the teaching styles, and then move on to more the specific nature of the styles themselves, I'd say the week before Doug Lemov, Shane, which was a wonderful episode in and of itself, we spoke with Dr. Catherine Johnston, Professor Joe Baker, episode 240, where they've done a fascinating paper on the impact of language and terminology on athlete development, and spoke exactly to what you're both speaking to in terms of the importance, and you used the word, Brendan, specificity. If we're not specific with our language, and we don't have the frameworks that helps us be specific with our language, then who knows what people are referring to in the room?
Exactly.
Which can create chaos, without us perhaps even knowing that we're actually creating chaos. Anyway, I want to be a great host here and direct us on, because I know there will be so many people listening and going, okay, this is great, this is awesome, you've got me, you have me here. So what are the styles? What are the styles? A to K. Let's start. What I want to do is unpack each style. And I know they're not linear, but or they're not utilized linearly. But A to K. What is A? And let's illustrate these with some examples if we can. A is command style, I believe. Brendan, would you like to talk to us? I'm sure most people listening will have heard of this term, command, but tell us a little bit about style A.
Yeah, command style, interestingly, is quite often confused with practice style.
Okay.
But to kind of define command style is usually chosen by a teacher for things such as synchronous on-cue movement, such as synchronized swimming, aerobic dance, or things such as that.
Mm-hmm.
It also would be chosen appropriately at times for when safety is of paramount importance, and you want perhaps, say, someone's throwing a javelin, or you've got a whole line of kids throwing a javelin, and you want them to throw it on cue, collect it on cue for obvious reasons. You don't want too much discovery learning when someone's got a sharp implement, etc. When I was reading about the spectrum, I got the impression that it was the style we love to hate in one way. A lot of people are like, I don't do that. Classic example of a non-versus approach. But having a chat with Sarah Ashworth once, we discussed how it's funny that a lot of really important ceremonies across cultures and religions have on-cue performances, such as weddings, opening ceremonies of Olympics, and we actually kind of stand there in awe when we see humans moving on cue. And I think for anyone who can do it, can move on cue, they'll realize that it is not a dumb style or just me following instructions. There is a lot of thinking going on, but predominantly the decision the student or learner makes is, will they move and will they try and stay on cue? So that's probably it in a nutshell, in a little 2-minute version.
Shane, anything to add on that one?
I did a good job.
Well, let me ask then, because I think for me, when I read command style, and before reading anything about it and listening to yourself there, Brendan, I think of it as a consultant who tends to work at the adult elite level, the professional level, if you like. I think of the importance that coaches have, or at least you could call it the pressure coaches have, to get teams performing, if you like. We've got to go on Saturday and we got to go win. The Matildas playing right now in the Soccer World Cup, England playing right now in the Soccer World Cup. It's like, we need these players to go perform, and we need to teach our game models. So is that command style as well? And, at the adult elite level, you do get players say to coach, tell me what to do, coach. Just tell me what to do. I'll go and do it. Is that command style as well? And also, Brendan, one last thing here is this notion of, especially again, I'm going to refer to the adult elite level, the professional level, but that's not to suggest this can't happen at younger age groups and development age groups. The pressure to teach actions in game whilst the game is going at full pace, surely command style is appropriate then, or am I misunderstanding this notion of command style?
No, I think you. The example that I described and is described in our book probably gives these very specific ones that I just gave. They're probably the common ways, but there would be times I can imagine where coaches may use a command style. Like if you were teaching a pattern of when Brendan dribbles a ball to here and then Shane moves when he sees this cue. So there might be at the start this type of command style. So even though the three of us are not moving synchronously, as in doing the same movement at the same time, we may be moving on each other's cue. Now, of course, that might just be the beginning part where we learn it, because as we know in a game, people won't just move when you tell them to. And then that environment would have to, what would you say, it would have to happen organically and players would have to recognize the cue. But at the start, yes, you could probably use a command style episode where you can imagine coaches walking someone through saying, and then when I see Dan go here, Shane, you make the run. All right, now let's practice this, and we go off the cues. So yes, that could, perhaps not a traditional way that you'd see it a lot from my coaching, etc.
Yep.
But yes, that could happen for sure.
Okay.
I think it does happen. You see the coach pull a player to the side and go, do it this way. So there's a clear mental representation provided to the player, and they're performing on cue when it happens. It's a command episode. Do it this way. Now go out and execute. And so they've now got the mental model of performance, do it this way. In the game, it becomes recall. I am expected to do this in this moment. You see it in basketball. In a timeout, the coach comes to the bench and draws the diagram, as Brendan says, move on the cue of my teammate. There is no variation from the pattern. This is the pattern that you run. So that's a command episode just there. And then when they get out on court, it's recall. So they're actually, in a sense, practicing what they've just been commanded to do, but they're practicing it in the context of live performance, but it's recall. And the coach is getting an assessment of whether they can recall it and to what degree they recall it.
Style B is practice style or task style. Brendan, can you take us through this?
Yeah, so as Billy actually kind of really linked those two together really well,
Okay.
the decisions that shift then to the learner in style B are the pace that they might practice at, the number of practices they will do. And normally with style A, since it is normally, traditionally, you're moving at the same time as someone else, the feedback is quite often built into it, because like if you two are moving really well and I'm out of sync with you, I, of course, start looking around and hang on, one of us is wrong. Oh, it's me. So you can still give feedback, but there is feedback quite often in the task. In style B, some people would call this the very traditional approach to teaching of I model the behavior or the movement with cues, drawing the attention to the learner of what I believe are specific or helpful cues. The learner then practices the task, quite often on their own, but with someone else as well, like throwing and catching. And then I, as the coach, would come along and usually give feedback to perhaps reinforce the behavior. Like, good work, Shane. I like the way that you're keeping your head over the ball. Or to correct the behavior and say, Shane, your ball's going up in the air. I think you need to keep your chest over the ball more when you strike it. And that's where now there's individual practice taking place, but the learner is replicating what we gave them, the coach gave them at the start, hopefully, and then we're providing feedback. So very, as I said, quite traditional way of coaching or teaching movement.
And the extra to that is the coach should come in and say, what should your head position be? And they say, oh, my head should be in this position. So the question is not discovery, it's inquiry to see if they actually understand or can recall what the cue is. So it's a form of practicing our understanding. And then we're assessing whether that understanding transfers into performance. So they can be practicing both the movement performance, but they can also be practicing, do they have the level of understanding? Do they have the mental representation? Do they have the recall of cues and the understanding of the cues? So practice can be a cognitive practice as well as a physical practice.
That's interesting. So, question on that, and I don't want to jump ahead to the other styles, but inquiring, asking these questions, is that encompassed within style B, or is that a different style?
Within style B, if the questions are there to get them to practice their thinking.
Gotcha. So I can see, Brendan, why style A and style B, people can confuse those two.
Mm.
Absolutely. Some people, I think, use the word command, just saying, oh, well, I commanded you to do it, rather than thinking about the concept of synchronous on cue movement is where I think but again, it's a great example, Dan, of if you want to call it sloppy language or non-specific language. When we look at what the learner is doing, and again, this is where we come back to the decisions. What is it I've asked the learner to do? I've asked them to move on cue. Okay, what did I ask the learner to do here? I asked them to go over there and practice. Did you give them a number? No. Did you tell them how fast? No. They're making those decisions. Must be practice style B then, because that's what they're doing.
Interesting. Style C, reciprocal coaching. Tell us a little bit about this.
Thought I'd just throw in there, sorry, before, both in Mitch Hewitt's coaching PhD and also when I used we did similar PhDs. I used to do it in the phys ed context. He did sport. We both found that style B is the most used style by coaches and PE teachers. Reciprocal style. This is the first style where we start to see the style requiring or allowing an episode to be created where students or players also develop social skills. So the teacher will still perhaps demonstrate a movement with cues. And now this is optional, this part, but normally I would give the first couple of times the student like a criteria or a task sheet, because otherwise they'll forget them. But maybe, 3 or 4 or whatever many cues you want there. And then you say to the pair, like I might say, Shane, you're going to be the doer. In other words, the person performing the movement. Dan, here is your task sheet with the cues. I'd like you to watch Shane kick the ball. And here's the 5 cues. I would like you to assess how well he is meeting this criteria. Now, and again, it's quite a classic. First few times I did this as a high school teacher, I would say I probably made Mostyn roll over in his grave. And then I probably realized, I'm not actually recognizing that these things called giving feedback, assessing movement, error critiquing, receiving feedback. These are all things called social skills. And as such, I must model also and teach them to individuals. So I used to say to them the first few times, these are the sentences starters. You will use, Shane, I like the way you are, and then insert the little criteria. Or Shane, next time you need to. So if he doesn't do it correctly. And then we swap those roles. So essentially now the decision that in style B for the teacher was to give feedback has now been given to the observer in this case, and then they do it. So, of course, I think it's quite amusing, as I said, funny to watch kids the first few times you'd walk around, and the teacher in this role or coach doesn't offer feedback, but you quite often see kids looking at you like, what are you doing? What are you doing, sir? What are you doing? You're supposed to be telling me. You go, no, Shane, talk to Dan. Dan, is Shane got his head over the ball? Yes. Did you tell him? No. Okay, Dan, tell him. And again, this whole concept of giving and receiving feedback, error identification, etc. And I got the opportunity actually to write a chapter with a guy, a real guru of Spectrum, Mike Goldberger, who he retired. We asked him to write a chapter for a book. He said, no, but here's some research I did. I never wrote it up. Very generous man. And he had done some research where he had a group of students taught a task using style B and a group doing style C. And the group doing style C only had half the amount of practice tasks as style B students. And they statistically had no significant difference in their improvement in this research that he did. Then he also got them and kind of just swapped them over and then taught them something else in pairs and let them go. And funnily enough, he found the people who'd been in style C were also more helpful as well to the group when they were learning. So, yeah.
There's some really good research that have come out of the phys ed space that our coaches can take a lead from. From around about age 10, players that are taught a process of providing that reciprocal feedback are able to do it with a high degree of accuracy. Also, the players that are providing that feedback, so they've had focused attention on the performance to be able to give their feedback to a teammate, then go into the practice task or the performance environment with elevated performance because they've mentally rehearsed the things that they need to do better. So they've, in a sense, they've done practice, not my physical practice, but the mental practice. And that leads to them focusing their attention and improving their performance outcome. So they don't have to be coached or taught by the coach, because the process of getting the empowerment of those coaches, those kids or those adults to coach others has led to the performance improvement because they focus on the same things.
It's so interesting what you're both saying, because it makes me think of how we can be greedy in terms of utilizing Style C to develop performance literacy that you're speaking to there, Shane. But also coming back to Brendan, your emphasis also on psychosocial skills. As a sports psychology consultant at the Coalface, I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a fairly leading soccer club over here in Europe, and in the gym, the instructors were doing exactly what you're speaking about, having players help each other to attain the right movements and assess each other. And the conversation we had afterwards was very much revolved around the importance of this for psychosocial skills and that social channel, if you like, because it's in simple terms, you're developing teamwork. You know, you could argue you're developing leadership, but you're developing teamwork because you're teaching people how to communicate effectively within that landscape.
I think obviously as phys ed teachers, we have a bit of and even though Pilly's done more coaching than me, but we kind of look at coaching relationship and teaching, that we see this massive amount of overlap, but it's like they don't always talk. And I know Pilly and I have had conversations before, is you would hate to think that there was a team of, 11 men or athletes or women running around and we're all on the same team, but I come over to you, Dan, and say, gee, look at Pilly, he's not really striking the ball well tonight. Should we tell him? Nah, don't worry about it. Like you'd think, well, no, why shouldn't we tell him? Oh, it's the coach's job. No, we don't. We're not going to wait until halftime for that to happen. But again, if that doesn't happen, then there mightn't be relationships built where that happens well, or that he takes that well.
We often talk about in athlete-centered coaching that you can tell the authenticity of an athlete-centered coach by who's doing most of the talking. If it's the players that are doing most of the talking, then you would go, I reckon I'm watching an athlete-centered coach here, because it seems to be empowered to the players to have the decision-making around how they're going, how well they're going, and what they need to do to improve the performance outcomes. And as Brendan said, there might be a framework that's been provided to the people that are brokering those conversations, so that those conversations are aligned with what the coach is expecting for the performance improvement. But it's an empowerment approach to coaching to get the conversations between peer to peer, not only to develop, importantly, the social relationships, but also so the players get used to taking direction and providing feedback to each other out on the field, so that adjustments to performance can happen in real time and not wait for the coach. So they're happening, do you remember this that happened in the quarter? No, I don't. Well, I'm asking you to remember because I've got a message for you. Well, that doesn't work. There's in Australian coaching, that's often talked about some research David Parkin did, where he got one of his students to interview the players after the game. Well, what did he talk about at quarter time? I can't remember what he talked about, but gee, he was passionate. What did he talk about at halftime? She said, I don't remember, but gee, he was angry. So they remembered the emotion, but not the message, because there was no alignment to, I guess, what had been the focus going into the game, and then no opportunity for retention by consistency of messaging. And so, if the players are empowered to do that analysis, they can come in and say, hey, according to how we set out to play, this is what's working, this is not working, and this is what we think we need to do. Is that aligned with what the data is telling you in the coach's box?
You're both going to get me wound up here, because this is precisely why I have these conversations on the Sports Psych Show, because I cannot see how, as a sports psychologist, I can be the best consultant I can be in an environment if I do not understand coaching, if I don't know the nuts and bolts, if I don't know about spectrum of coaching styles, teaching styles, because so much of what you're saying is linked to the kind of things I have to do as a sports psychologist to try to work systemically, to try to help coaches and all key stakeholders create a healthy and safe environment, because that's just not linked to the well-being and the mental health protocols and practices I bring in. Okay, it's linked to efficacious and effective coaching. Great coaching sprinkles down onto wellness and well-being of players, because players feel cared for. They feel that they are being looked after. They feel their game, which is so important to them, is being looked after. When you feel that way, I'm not saying that is the 360-degree solution for well-being and mental health, but it does influence and make a difference. So, yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, so moving on to style D, self-check. Brendan, tell us a little bit about self-check.
Self-check, this is where I'm going to sound like a real spectrum nerd. This is probably a style which I wouldn't say I wasn't a big fan of, but I've probably come to love a little bit more in the last few, or probably the last 5 years. So if you imagine style C, we had a doer and observer. Just imagine now that we put those two jobs together, and you're no longer in a pair, you're on your own. So the teacher gives you some criteria, can be a sheet just in case they forget it, could write it on a whiteboard, whatever, and says, I want you to perform this movement or procedure or whatever, and I want you to check against the criteria, and you assess your own movement, how well you're doing those things. The coach's job now, and it's the same as in style C, if the coach jumps in and says, what are you doing? That's not right. You've just reverted it back to style B, in that you are giving the feedback. So now the coach has to have a little bit more refined questioning skills. So if I said to Shane, how do you think you did there with your head over the ball? Oh, I nailed it. Okay, let me video you. You do it again. Okay, have a look at that. What do you think? Oh, okay, maybe I need to work on that. Maybe you do. This is again when Mostyn came up with this. I think 20 years ago, you were using video camera. This was very hard to do. You were maybe using a mirror. It was very hard to do. Now that every athlete, participant is walking around probably with a mobile phone in their pocket, this style, I think, has also really come to its own as well. I was thinking the other night, again, showing my spectrum nerdiness, I was in the cricket nets throwing some balls to my daughter, and I was thinking, here's a little bit of self-check. Even though I hadn't set out the criteria for her, I threw something. It was an off drive. She didn't move a foot that far. And I just went to put my finger up like this. She goes, I know. I need to move my foot. I was like, okay, would you like to try that again? She goes, yes, please. And I didn't say anything more than that, but I kind of thought, lovely self-check style there, done on their own. She's self-assessing. I didn't give her the criteria, but she knows the criteria. She self-assessed. There's probably some of the stuff here, again, I think it links to coaching, where the last thing we need is me running around on the sporting field going, gee, I'm not doing something well. Oh, if only I could work it out. Oh, don't worry, I'll just wait till half time and I'll talk to Pilly. He'll tell me. That you'd go, no, he'll probably have taken me off by then if I'm doing it that badly. But also people have done research on this style, speaking about an autonomy supportive environment where the athlete is self-regulating, or mastery climates in encouraging greater motivation, greater buy-in by the athlete, and all these kind of things as well. So, yeah, it's a good...
A great example we use in our book, given the Ashes have just been retained by Australia, it was Ricky Ponting some years ago invested in a big screen TV and a video camera because he was having I can't remember what the exact problem was that he had developed, whether he was pushing too far in front of his front pad and consistently edging to slips, or whether he was falling over to the offside and hitting his pads and getting a leg before. I forget which was. But in order to self-check his performance, he put the video on time delay, play the shot, look up, self-check, because he had the criteria already in his head. He knew the cues as an elite performer, go back, do it again until the new movement model had become habituated. He didn't need a coach to help him. He was using the self-check. I mean, he'd had a coach help him in a sense in the past to develop that, the procedural knowledge to know how to do it. So he had the ability to come up with the performance parameters as a checklist for himself. And then he was able to set up the practice environment to be able to do it. We often see in elite sport, whether it be with juniors or seniors, players have to check the video before they have their debrief with their line coaches. And that debrief of the video, there would be some performance parameters guiding that debrief. Self-check.
Inclusion style. Style E. Brendan, talk to us a little bit about inclusion style.
Yeah, Style E. So now you can see the decisions are really starting to be handed over more and more to the learner. And again, this kind of thing happens here where the teacher or coach is responsible for creating a learning episode where there are 2 or more levels of challenge. If you want to create 10, good luck. It's going to obviously test the learner a bit, but 2 or more levels of challenge. And you ask the learner then to choose the level which they believe is appropriate for them to practice at. And again, the same as the 2 previous styles, the teacher's role is, again, as these decisions are being handed over, the teacher is obviously making less decisions in this case. So the kind of conversations that you would have is around saying, oh, well, Shane, I see you've chosen to participate at level whatever, green or red or 5 or whatever you want to do, number or color them. How are you going with that level? And he might then explain what's going on. Now, if he's chosen a good level, I might ask him, do you think this is an appropriate level? And he says yes. And I ask him perhaps to explain why. And then I must either, the coach, accept or challenge his choice by referring to perhaps success parameters or the ability to perform the movement smoothly, efficiently, whatever the parameters are that perhaps you've described at the start of the episode. But again, there's this choosing what's an appropriate level of challenge. This also can lead into, if someone consistently is choosing something that's too easy, having conversations about, if you stay practicing at this level, do you think you're likely to improve? What are you going to need to do you think, to improve? You can ask them to modify the task themselves and say, well, what would you do here to make this perhaps harder? Is level 5 too hard? Let's see if we can do something in the middle. So they start actually becoming responsible for making decisions about not only where they should practice, but how they can challenge themselves to do this.
Fascinating. And I want to come to you here, Shane. This makes me think what Brendan was describing here with style E, inclusion style, is we can actually draw on cognitive theories and frameworks. We've spoken quite a bit on the Sports Psych Show about cognitive load theory, fidelity of practice, and the challenge point framework from recently updated by Nicola Hodges and Keith Lurs. And I'm thinking of those 3 that we've spoken about on the Sports Psych Show and how they're so relevant for this style as you're co-creating that challenge point with players. Those 3 things come to mind that's important. How much cognitive load is on this player? Are they stretching themselves too much? What is the fidelity of practice? Is it highly representative, highly specific? And, are they getting that right challenge point? No question, mate. Just a thought.
Oh, spot on. And using language that comes from education, it provides for differentiation of performance expectations. Because we can have...
Oh, can you unpack that?
Well, so we can differentiate by task. So the task challenge point is different based on your readiness as a learner. If we go back to challenge point, where your challenge point is, in education we talk about readiness. Differentiation by assessment. There are different assessment criteria based on where you are in your development journey. We can have differentiation of the performance environment. So we're doing different tasks, not just a different scale of task, but different task expectation, because we can say, well, you can already do these things. So to continue your learning, we've already done that in the warm up and practice that. We know you can do that. So you're going on to a completely different task. So there's different ways of differentiating the performance practice expectation based on what we call the readiness of the learner, which is what they bring to the task in terms of knowledge, skill, and understanding. So we recognise that in a group of 20 or 30 players, there will be a performance continuum. So if we do just the one challenge point, we are only catering for those players that are ready for that challenge point. Those that are ahead of it, okay, they're not actually getting any learning out of it because they can already do it. Those that are not at that challenge point may actually be experiencing a high level of anxiety because they're going into it going, there is no way I can do this. If we put that into coaching children, the anxious ones might become behaviour problems because they want to do something else so they don't show the coach and their peers that they're not up to the task. And the ones that are too good for the task become bored and start to become a behavioural problem, not because they're bad kids, but because they're bored. And so they seek to do things which will excite them and energise them.
Really interesting stuff. Brendan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when you start having this, it also creates a nice environment in that it's no longer someone going, oh, well, I'm the best at doing this one activity, because of course there's always going to be someone who's not as good or someone who's better. But when we actually start getting people to have internal focus on what am I doing, and if it allows, I think, again, from an educative perspective, oh, well, I'm better than Shane. Yeah, okay, Brendan, great. But you're not really succeeding at your task now. So how about you keep working at your task? Or this achieving a point and being internally focused rather than just saying, oh, well, I'm better than him at this or I'm better than her at that, which can create a whole lot of other behavioural issues and things as well. And people not actually really challenging themselves. Because I guess before a training session, if I was better than Shane, I was better than him then, and I'm probably better than him when I do it. But that's really irrelevant to my learning, except perhaps learning to be a bad person because I'm feeling good about being better than someone else versus my learning, trying to improve my skill. And the same at the other end, if you want to say of this spectrum or the example here of Shane feeling bad, but going, well, he doesn't need to feel bad. This is just where the stage of learning he is at, and he improved in his learning in this session, which of course then that's where the conversations can be around those things. But yeah, I think this is where, as Shane said, you get this real beginning of coaches started to recognize it's not a one size fits all. And if you are coaching like that, then yes, perhaps you do have a very highly skillful team at a high level. But the reality is for most coaches, that's probably not how life is. We do have players who are not always as good as others at certain things, and we can differentiate our practice and show them that we're trying to help them improve.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating stuff. And it's so fascinating that I've let time click on. I've noticed that we've only got up to style E. So we've only done 5 styles. And we've got 11 to cover. And I want to be respectful of both of your times here. But I'm going to reframe this. I think what excites me is getting you both back to go through the rest of the styles in detail. But perhaps, Brendan, you can offer us an overview of styles F through to K, which my understanding is F through to K moves towards more player-centered coaching away from coach-driven coaching. Is that correct?
Yeah, roughly, Dan. It's Sarah Ashworth always didn't like some of those terms, but she was always a bit of a wordsmith with player centered and all those kind of things. But you're certainly not offending Pilly or myself. They clumped the styles, the A to E that we've just done. They called them actually the reproduction cluster because they said you were using the dominant cognitive operation of memory when you're in them. And so F to K, they called the production cluster, where they actually say or suggest that the learner now will be producing knowledge that is new to them, just to them, not to the world, just to them. So they're called the discovery episodes is another term for them as well. So style F is guided discovery. Again, probably one of the most misunderstood styles that probably in one way began Pilly and my relationship in depth. So it's the style that we both think fondly of. But it's basically questioning, normally one person on their own, using open-ended questions to lead them. So if you want to think about Socratic questioning, that's probably the way. And there is an aha moment, to use a cliche. Style G is convergent discovering. So probably a lot of your listeners would be familiar with this term of convergent thinking. Coach sets a problem or a question where there is one answer. This quite often gets confused. It's quite often people say, I'm going to do convergent thinking, but there's actually multiple answers. So it really becomes like that horrific teaching situation where the kid yells out the answer and the teacher's, no, not that one. But that's right, sir. Yeah, it is, but I wasn't thinking of that one.
Yeah.
So if you actually had multiple answers, that's where you have style H, divergent discovery. So you actually want the learner to discover multiple answers to the problem. And then the last three are quite unique, I, J, and K, which we'll go through them in detail, obviously, later. But these are not actually, just to sound confusing here, these are not one episode. They are numerous episodes. And there is a lot of responsibility handed over to the learner, where ultimately they get to style K, aptly titled self-teaching or self-coaching style. In our case, where we're talking about sports coaching, where if there is a coach, it is only because the participant requests the coach and they view the coach as like a resource. But 9 times out of 10, there is probably no coach in that episode at all with self-teaching. They are on their own. And in our book, I have my own favorite example, but I don't know if you've seen the documentary by Alex Honnold, the guy who free climbed El Capitan. So there's a TED talk with him where he speaks about, what he did. And since obviously no one had ever done it, there was no one who could even coach him in doing it. So that was probably a great example.
Okay.
I think, Pilly, would I be right in guessing your Craig Johnson story is probably one of your favorite self-coaching ones? I think they're quite incredible, obviously, when you get individuals doing it, whether it's sport or not. But yeah, they're the last 6, Dan, to try and give a quick overview.
When we talk about game-based approaches, they often get confused as being production style episodes. But as we talked earlier, when we look at the textbooks, when we look at the research papers that are conceptual and they're giving examples of a constraints-based episode or a game-based episode, often the questions don't come after an episode where the thinking has been made visible. So therefore, it can't be presumed that they are production episodes because we haven't found out where the gap in knowledge is. So quite likely, particularly if a good teaching strategy has been employed and we've used an objective, or we've used a know, do, understand, or some other cognitive setting of the performance expectation to provide a mental model of performance going into it, we're just doing recall. How well have they understood that cognitive setting provided at the start, whether that be by the outcome, the objective, the description that was provided at the start?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating stuff. And as I say, I think we've set this up perfectly to do a deep dive on styles F to K in the next episode that we record together. But we've also left a bit of a teaser for those listening in because they can learn more about styles A to E and also F to K in a book you've co-written alongside Josh Rankin and Mitch Hewitt, co-written and edited as well, because there's many authors involved, and it's called The Spectrum of Sport Coaching Styles. So I think to finish this off, Brendan, we'll come to you first. How can people find you, follow you, and how can people get hold of this book, The Spectrum of Sport Coaching Styles?
Spectrum of Sport Coaching Styles is through Routledge, Taylor and Francis. So if you go to their website, of course, it's available there. I'm on Twitter. I think I'm Dr. Brendan SueSee, and I'm not a big tweeter, so to speak. Perhaps that's good for everyone, but or X or whatever it is now. And that's probably, and occasionally I'm on LinkedIn as well, engaging in some things. And I work at the University of Southern Queensland, which I'm always happy to answer any questions. And I fully confess to being, as I say, poisoned by the spectrum or a spectrum nerd, and always happy to talk pedagogy, sports coaching, because as I said, I see them as really, really quite often the same or similar. It's just that quite often there's a bit of a different outcome required, obviously, in the professional sporting world, but there's a lot of similar things along the way in terms of how you achieve those things.
Fantastic. And Shane, coming to you, how can people find you, follow you, and get in touch if you'd like them to?
I'm at Flinders University in Adelaide, South Australia, so you can find me through my university homepage. Go to the university homepage, type in search Shane Pill, and it will take you there. Google search like Brendan, and you'll be able to find me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's my preferred social media connection platform. And you can also DM me via X, Twitter, and get in contact with me that way as well.
Gents, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Dan.
Appreciate you having us on.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sportslight Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.